All right, cool. So, welcome back, everyone. I'm glad to see we've got, people coming back for this class. That's always a good sign. So last week we got into an awful lot of kind of broad outline kind of stuff regarding the different periods of rabbinic history. At this point, we're going to start jumping into fulfill the actual, brief of our class, which is to be looking at particular rabbis throughout Jewish history and learning a little bit about them, about who they were, so that when we, kind of introduce them, talk about them offhand in the process of our Torah discussions, you'll know who we're talking about. So you may recall from last week, and if you don't, I'm just going to share the screen here real quick just to remind folks that that this is, let me admit Sharon here. There we go. Okay. So just to kind of briefly recap from last week, the early period of rabbinic history is divided into the period of the Zugot. That means pairs, right? Because we're like the recording of that generation. It's like the rabbis always appear in pairs. That's the period of the Second Temple leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple, followed by the Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, and the Savoraim, the sort of unnamed sages who were responsible for editing together the Gemara into the complete document that we know of as the Babylonian Talmud. This week, we are going to be looking at Hillel and Shammai, who are the last of the Zugot. They are the last important sages who belong to that period of Zugot of, important pairs of rabbinic sages prior to the sort of advent of rabbinic Judaism per se, right? These are members of the group known at the time as the Perushim, or the Pharisees. And Hillel and Shammai have an awful lot going on. They're an important pair of figures in the early history of rabbinic Judaism. So Hillel and Shammai, they were the leaders at the time of the Pharisees, right? The group of the sect of Jews during the Second Temple who eventually go on to be the sort of founders and forebears of the early rabbis. And as we find in the case of the Zugot generally, Hillel and Shammai have a particular kind of relationship where Hillel is the Nasi, the president of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court of the time, and Shammai is the Av Beit Din at the same time. That was not the case throughout their lives. At first, there was a different sage who was the Av Beit Din to Hillel's Nasi, but after he passed away, Shammai took over, and he was the Av Beit Din for the rest of the time that Hillel was the Nasi. So I'm going to talk briefly about the two of them individually, and then we'll talk about them both together and why they appear as a pair and why the pair of them are so important in the context of rabbinic Judaism. So let's start by looking at Hillel. Hillel is born in Babylonia. He comes from the Babylonian Jewish community, which is going to become much more important and central to the Jewish world a number of generations later, but still already by that time is a fairly large and developed Jewish population, right? He later on in life, some traditions say when he was about 30 years old, moves to Eretz Yisrael to study. He is said at the time to have been extremely poor. According to one Talmudic story, Hillel earned only 1 tropek a day. That was an incredibly small amount of money. And out of this, it says he'd use half of it to feed and take care of his family, and the other half he would give to the door warden, the guard of the Beit Midrash, of the house of study. So according to the story, one Erev Shabbat, he didn't earn enough to pay the guard, so he wasn't allowed in to study. He climbed up on the roof and he listened in at the window to hear what was being taught. It was very cold and it began to snow. And in the morning, the teachers remarked on how it was darker than usual. So they sent up someone to check, and they found Hillel covered up in 4 feet of snow, and they had to dig him out on Shabbat. For this reason, Hillel is held up as a sort of key central proponent of the centrality and importance of Torah study to Jewish practice, right? He is someone who sacrificed an awful lot in order to be able to study. He moved out of his, where he moved away from his birthplace. He didn't make a lot of money. He was able to he nevertheless devoted himself intensely to Jewish study, and eventually rose to become a central key figure of the Jewish community of his day, right? He was the head of the Sanhedrin. And so because of this, it's said that after a person's death, if they try to claim that they couldn't study Torah on account of poverty, the heavenly court brings out Hillel as an example that's no excuse, right? That no matter who we are and no matter what our means happen to be, that we should always do our best to study Torah to the degree to which we have any opportunity to do so. So that's Hillel. Hillel is also known for being an extremely mild person. He was sort of proverbial for being very difficult to get angry. There's, another story about a couple of people who essentially made a bet, to see if, one of them could get him angry. And the person who was trying to get him angry ends up getting very angry himself, because no matter what he says to Hillel, he insults, the Babylonians and their round heads. He bugs Hillel about, not being able to believe that he is this guy that everybody says is so important. He needles him in a variety of ways, and Hillel is just completely unfazable. He's known for being difficult to get angry. Shammai, of course, is in some respects the reverse, as we'll see in a story that we're going to look at some point here. So who's Shammai? Shammai is sort of Hillel's counterpart. He is his counterpart in an official way, right? In the sense that Hillel and Shammai are both heads of the Sanhedrin in their day, but he's also Hillel's counterpart in the manner of being sort of adversaries when it comes to their teachings on Jewish practice. Hillel and Shammai are often held up against one another as having differing halakhic opinions. So Shammai is said to have been a builder by trade. In other words, he built houses. And a number of things are known about him as a person. Among them, he's known for his custom of preparing for Shabbat all week. So he's held up as an example of this, as some of the importance of not just leaving Shabbat for Shabbat, but actually doing our best to prepare for Shabbat all week. It said that he would, for example, make sure to save the best food, right? Not eat it on the weekday, but he would save it for Shabbat. There's also an interesting story about him in Mishnah Sukkot, which I bring up mainly because it's Sukkot. We're doing this particular lesson from the Sukkah. So in Mishnah Sukkot, it talks about how when Shammai's daughter-in-law gave birth to a boy during Sukkot, Shammai broke away the roof plastering of the house and put a sukkah up over the bed for the sake of the child, so that the child could have the experience of dwelling in the sukkah for the festival.
Oh.
So Hillel and Shammai, right? The real key thing about these two sages is that they both had large numbers of disciples. In Hillel's case, the traditional number is 80 disciples, 80 students of note that he trained up, one of whom was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And if you don't know that name yet, keep it in mind, because we're going to get back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He's going to play an important role in just a little bit. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is said to have been the least of Hillel's students, which, if you know anything about Yochanan ben Zakkai, is not so much a dig on Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai as it is an indication of the remarkableness of Hillel's students. But both Hillel and Shammai raised up many students, so much so that they developed groups around themselves who adhered to that particular sage's halakhic approach. And so frequently in the later rabbinic literature, we don't so much talk so much about Hillel and Shammai as individuals. What you hear about is Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, by which we mean the school of students who adhered to that particular teacher's halakhic approach. And the fact that there could be these two such distinct schools, right, two distinct houses, is indicative of the degree to which the two of them tended to disagree quite a bit. There are several recorded halakhic disagreements that occurred specifically between Hillel and Shammai, the people, but there are many, many, many more disagreements between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. There's over 300 different disagreements on halakhic points that have been recorded between the schools of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. In general, the positions of Beit Hillel are notable for being more lenient, more liberal than those of Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai tends to be the more stricter of the two when it comes to their halakhic approach. So what I want to do now here is share the screen. I want to look at some of the teachings of these rabbis to actually kind of get thereby a sort of more of a sense of their personalities, so that we can then maybe kind of explore who they were a little bit through that lens. So I'm going to share the pages that I've got up here. Great, there we go. So I've got a number of pieces of text here related to Hillel and Shammai. The first of these is probably the best known. It's a passage that comes from Mishnah Avot, Pirkei Avot. This comes from chapter 1, Mishnayot 12 through 15. So it's a chunk of Mishnayot that kind of all go together. Would someone mind unmuting and reading the first paragraph for us?
Mishnah Avot. Hillel and Shammai received the oral tradition from them, Shemaiah and Atalon. Hillel used to say, "Be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving mankind and drawing them close to the Torah." Should I continue?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. He also used to say, "One who makes his name great causes his name to be destroyed. One who does not add to his knowledge causes it to cease. One who does not study the Torah deserves death. One who makes unworthy use of the crown of learning shall pass away." He also used to say, "If I am not for myself, who is for me? But if I am myself, my own self only, what am I? And if not now, when?"
Awesome. Thanks, yeah. Mickey. Let's pause there for a second, because all of these teachings so far are supposedly the sayings of Rabbi Hillel. So I want to just pause and look at these teachings real quick, the teachings that are ascribed to Rabbi Hillel, and see if anyone has see what people think about them. Do these raise any feelings for you? Do you feel like you get a sense from some of these about who Hillel was and what was important to him? What are your impressions of these sayings that we get from Rabbi Hillel?
Well, he wants us to love peace and pursue peace and loving and so forth. The second one kind of made me kind of mixed up a little bit. He who makes his name great causes his name to be destroyed. I don't know if he meant that because we're bragging about being so great. I wasn't sure if that's where he was going with that.
Let's try and like dig into that. So like what exactly do you think that he's saying there? So Eileen, you were saying that maybe it means that if someone's kind of, puffing himself up, that might end up dragging himself, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess that means that then his name would be destroyed. That we shouldn't do that. I understand that one who does not add to his knowledge causes it to cease. Yes, of course, that makes sense. He's a little bit strict on one who does not study deserves death, but all right, I can, the time period, I guess, demanded that. One who makes unworthy use of the crown of learning shall pass away. Also, means that you should learn all the time, I guess.
Yeah. So
And can
yeah.
I throw in also, it reminds me of the parts of the Shema, like that second paragraph, that basically, if you don't do what's put out before you, you're going to have all this downfall around you. It's like, don't be idle. Use your time effectively. Use your time well, and bring yourself closer to Torah. That's my take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember what we know also about Hillel and his early life, right? That he put himself through a lot and ended up sacrificing quite a lot in order to be able to study Torah. That was something that was really extremely important to him. And I think a number of these teachings that we're seeing that are the aphorisms of Hillel maybe speak to the level of importance that he places personally and culturally on Torah study as an activity. It clearly occupies a really central place in Hillel's value system.
It also seems like he really wants there to be, I don't know, maybe balance, because he wants the learning and the studying that one's doing to be for the right reasons, essentially.
So what's your sense of what the right reasons are for Hillel?
Well, first of all, so that you're not deserving of death.
Sure. Okay.
So that's a good one. And if you are learning or using your learning in the wrong way, you would be abusing the crown of learning, and therefore also, be at risk of passing away.
Yeah, I think that point and the point about not making one's name great kind of go together, right? Because when we're talking about the crown, we're talking about the crown of Torah. In other words, the social status that comes in rabbinic Jewish circles from being learned, right? And we find that that's the case even in contemporary Judaism, right? That people who have a reputation for being well learned in the Torah and in Jewish learning tend to have a lot of status. We tend to have a lot of respect for such people. I think part of what he may be saying here is that status should not be used, right? It should not be used to influence people or to get what you want. It's not, Torah should be studied for its own sake, in other words, and not for the sake of elevating your social status relative to other people.
Or securing business deals or anything else, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Judy has something to say.
No, when I saw he who extends his name destroys it, I was thinking of the two opposite words that start with H, hubris and humility. And I think we know from the Greek tragedies, which Hillel might have known about, that it's always the hubris that seems to be the destroyer. So I think that's what he's saying, is that no matter how much you know, how scholarly you are, how much you respect it, you still need to have that sense of humility. Because if you go with the hubris, it's going to destroy you.
Absolutely. The importance of humility and avoiding, you know, excessive, unwarranted pride that's going to lead us into, you know, maybe unrighteous or foolish behavior. Absolutely. All right. So
this goes back to, in my memory, of a professor, one of the first professors I had when I returned to college. And he mentioned something that was something similar to that. And this was a psychology class. And he said that people who, you know, sometimes people who have a lot of degrees and whatever, they go about and they don't have much humility. They think that they're really something special because they have studied so much in a particular field. And he said it has always been his impression that the people who had the most humility, I can't think of the name now, humility, and the people who were less, many times more educated in the field, but they realized as much as they knew, there was so much that they still didn't know.
That's true.
And I think, and I found that to be the case so many times when I was, you know, a student in the graduate school and as an undergraduate, because I really thought that I knew quite a bit about this or that. And the more I learned, the less I agreed with my own ideas of myself. I realized how little I knew. There was so much more.
absolutely. The importance of not letting your learning get in the way of future learning.
Right. Absolutely.
All right. I want to look at the passage here. There's a lot of teachings here that are recorded from Rabbi Hillel, but we've also got a passage which talks about some of the sayings of Shammai. I don't know, Ross, would you mind reading that one for us?
Just the last sentence there.
The one about Shammai, yeah.
Shammai used to say, "Make your study of the Torah a fixed practice. Speak little, but do much, and receive all men with a pleasant countenance."
Awesome, thank you. All right, so what do we get from this, about Shammai and his perspective on things?
Sounds like, to me, it sounds like be consistent in your studying. Make sure that you have a time set apart, I guess, each day. Speak little, I guess, don't speak too much, but do much, act on things and do much, and always be pleasant. Yeah, I guess that's showing a sense of humility too, being pleasant.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
Big stick, right. Very good.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because in a way, he's covered the same ground, but or very similar ground at any rate, with a whole lot less words, which seems to be consistent with the words that he's actually saying, and with a little bit more of like a terse approach to it, not necessarily unpleasant, but just sort of very matter of fact and maybe a little bit more rigid.
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think, an important point that I want to kind of think about, especially as we are exploring the lives of these individuals who appear in the sort of classic texts of Rabbinic Judaism, is that in most of these cases, right, what we've really got about these figures is remarkably little when you compare it to, for example, a modern biography, right, where you could read a book that's 600 pages long about a particular historical figure that incorporates all kinds of rich, you know, historical sources and documents and things like that, right? When you compare what we have about the rabbis to that sort of material, it seems like very little. But what comes through in the teachings and the aphorisms that we inherit from these rabbis that are preserved in the oral tradition and recorded in the Mishnah and later on in the Gemara, are often expressed in ways that can give us a very strong sense of a person's personality, of a figure's personality and their values and ideas and what is important to them, right? Even if what we have is not so verbose, right? A lot can come out of these little sort of episodes that are recorded and these little kind of aphorisms that are set down that can give us a really strong perspective on these individuals. And also because of, you know, the diversity of different stories that we find about some of the more important rabbis, we can also sometimes get a glimpse into the complexities of these figures. With that in mind, I want to share a different text. This is a story about Hillel and Shammai and their differing approach, their differing treatment of an individual who came to them looking for wisdom. So I'm going to scroll down to another passage. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, 31a. This is probably one of the more famous stories about Hillel and Shammai. It's actually part of a larger story. This is the part of the story dealing with one prospective convert. There's actually 3 of them in the longer story. I didn't want to get into the longer story tonight because it would take too much time. I would have loved to engage with it, but can I get another reader? How about Joe? Would you mind reading this one?
Let me just get to it here. Okay. There was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, "Convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot." Shammai pushed him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. This was a common measuring stick, and Shammai was a builder by trade. The same Gentile came before Hillel. He converted him and said to him, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study."
Mhm.
Great. That's a common one. I remember this, yeah, studying this before. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very good. Yeah.
So we've got this story. The same individual comes to Shammai and then to Hillel. Their response to this, asking for the same thing, right? Convert me to Judaism, right? Under the condition that you teach me the whole of the Torah while you're standing on one foot. Their response to this individual is remarkably different. What would you say is the essence of that difference?
I would say Hillel gave the Gentile a better reason for studying more, because the other one kind of just pushed him away and said, "Oh, you're, just ignoring him and seeing he was superficial." But I think Hillel gave him an opening, saying, "Listen, go." He gave him an entrance into studying more and maybe to conversion. So I think he left an opening for that. And I thought that's very smart. That's very good. That's the way we should teach, to give people some more wisdom.
Yeah, well, I'm going back to in Pirkei Avot 15, where we quoted Shammai. Shammai's actually going against what he said in 15, because he's saying, "Say little and do much, and receive all men with a pleasant countenance." Now, obviously, he didn't receive this person with a pleasant countenance, but Hillel actually goes and says practically the same thing that Shammai is saying, because Hillel is saying very little. He's just saying, don't do what's hateful to yourself, to your neighbor. And then he said, and now go study. That's what, and now you need to do the action. So say little, do much. So I don't understand how Shammai could say what he did. And then in that story, it seems as though Shammai totally went against what he said.
Yeah. So this is what I mean when I say that we can sometimes catch glimpses of the complexities of these figures and the richness of their lives, right? That we maybe couldn't just from looking at one of their teachings or one of their sayings, like a tiny little snapshot of one moment in their lives. So Shammai, we've already seen, at least has the value of receiving all men with a pleasant countenance, is the way that he puts it. And yet, in the case of this individual who came to him, right, and gave him this condition, please, I want you to convert me, but only on the condition that you can teach me the Torah on one foot. He drives him off with his builder's cubit, right? So
Right.
what is it about this situation? Like, given that we know that Shammai at least considers it an important value to receive people with a pleasant countenance, what do folks think is the reason then why Shammai drives this particular individual off with his builder's cubit instead of receiving with a pleasant countenance?
Because he probably didn't think he was sincere, because it sounds silly.
It
It
sounds
does
silly, yeah.
silly.
It's
Yeah, I
like
think-
sometimes I've heard, I mean, I have nothing against teachers, but every once in a blue moon, you'll hear something like, oh, he doesn't really want to learn, or something like that, because you can only sit with a disinterested child in your class for half the year and realize I don't think he wants to learn, or I'm not teaching to his style. People get impertinent with something that they're asked to do, and the Torah on one foot seems to be kind of like a stupid request. as it were.
It's a silly request and maybe even a disrespectful request, right?
Yes, it's certainly disrespectful. Yes.
I'm thinking that he thought that it was like presumptuous and disrespectful of this individual to approach him with that type of request. And that, he is not actually going to be able to maybe educate someone that seems so unreceptive to like the breadth and scope of what he would be offering to teach him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is then very interesting in the different approach that Hillel has, which is that he accepts this student, this Gentile prospective convert, right? Absurd and disrespectful condition and all, and does in fact convert them, and then addresses the absurdity of the claim. In the longer version of this story that this is only a part of, I mentioned that there's two other individuals who come to Hillel and Shammai with similar results. And I'll tell you, the long story short, both of the other ones also come with an absurd condition for converting, right? One of them comes and says, make me a convert, but only on the condition that I can accept the written Torah, but not the oral Torah, which, as we know from the standpoint of the Pharisees and the rabbis, is a completely absurd, ask, right? Once in that one too, Shammai drives him away. Hillel accepts him and then sort of patiently devises a trick to kind of show him that the oral Torah is just as important as the written Torah. And then also there's a third Gentile who comes to the both of them, and that one says, I want to become Jewish, make me a convert, but only on the condition that I can become the high priest, which is not something that you can be if you were a convert, right? The priests are a family, it's an inherited thing. So it's not like he can become the high priest or even a priest of any kind, right? There too, Shammai
Who
chases him.
asks for that sort of thing? It's pretty,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, and there's maybe something there, right? That there's an inherent disrespect in the way that these individuals are coming to these great teachers, right? Which there's a justification then in Shammai's reaction. But interestingly enough, Hillel's approach ultimately ends up bringing them closer to Torah, as is acknowledged in the denouement of the story. All right. So in connection with this,
Excuse me, I was on mute. Judy wanted to say
No,
something.
I'm just thinking what Hillel did is what we talk about so much today, is we need to meet people where they are.
Mhm.
And that's what Hillel always seems to have done. He understood the person that was in front of him and was always flexible enough with his understanding of human nature to be able to figure out the way to reach that person where that person stands.
Yeah, I think in many respects, Hillel is much closer to the sort of spirit of our age than Shammai is. And for that reason, it might be a little easier for people of our time to understand Hillel's perspective. And I think it might be comparatively harder for us to understand Shammai's perspective. But I do think it's also important to recognize that Shammai's also got a point, right? That there's a role for, that there is a certain amount of importance to decorum and respect, and that maybe there's times that we don't have to accept like everybody's absurd conditions, right? Or everybody's, disrespectful behavior. That there may be another side to that argument as well.
Yeah, I mean, especially the guy who wants to be the high priest. I mean, assuming that he converts, I mean, is he going to go and parade himself and say, "See, now I'm a high priest now"? I mean, it's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, the story ends up going that, the way that Hillel approaches it, right, is he converts the man, right? He becomes Jewish, and then Hillel has him sit down and study Torah. And then by studying Torah, the man slowly comes to understand on his own that it's not something that he is able to do as, a convert, as he comes to understand more about what's involved in being the priest, right? So there too, right, once again, the sort of moral of the story is that that Torah study, and that if you can bring someone to the Torah to engage in Torah, then over time they will come to develop wisdom, even if they came to the Torah maybe for not the most perfect set of motivations. That there's always a chance that somewhere along the line, if they start out by engaging for maybe not quite the perfect reasons, they will eventually come to a deeper understanding. But that you have to get them to do that study first, right? And that's the key point, right? The go and study part of Hillel's, statement in the part of the story that we read. The go and study part is the really important part, right? We put a lot of emphasis on that which is hateful to yourself, don't do to your neighbor, right? But really, in a sense, the really important part is that last part, right? Go and study. It's the study that makes the Jew in this story.
So Hillel's teaching style then, if I'm getting the right idea, sounds like it would be more like that he's able to lead the student to the information as opposed to just like and allowing the student to sort of discover the learning and learn, figure it out for himself with that guidance, as opposed to maybe like here is the information, I'm just sort of handing it to you in a passive mode kind of thing. I could be wrong, but.
So in addition to being just different people, right, Hillel and Shammai are also, of course, sages, right, who are primarily concerned with the halakha, right, with determining what is the nature of correct Jewish practice in accordance with the written and the oral Torah, right? And the differences between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, between their two schools, are pretty much centered around these halakhic differences. I wanted to share an example of what we're talking about here. This is just one of, as I said, over 300 instances in the rabbinic literature in which Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai differ on some point of halakhic practice. So this is from Mishnah Brachot. Brachot is blessings, right? Chapter 1, Mishnah 3. I'm just going to read this one. So the beginning of Mishnah Brachot is all about the proper time and manner in which to read the Shema every day. That's the subject matter that they're talking about. Beit Shammai say, in the evening, every person must recline and recite the Shema. And in the morning, they must stand, as it says, when you lie down and when you rise. That's from the passage in Devarim, Deuteronomy, that we get the reading of the commandment for reading the Shema to come. That's where that commandment comes from. Right? And Beit Hillel say, every person recites Shema just as they are. In other words, whether they're standing or they're sitting. As it says, and when you walk along the way. That's That's from the same verse. If so, why does it say when you lie down and when you rise? At the time when people lie down and at the time when people rise. Okay. So a couple key points about this, right? Number one, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai agree on the basic key point here, right? Which is we're supposed to recite the Shema twice every day. The difference has to do in the subtleties of that practice. So the opinion of Beit Shammai is that because it says when you lie down and when you rise, that means that when we say Shema in the evening, we need to literally lie down and recite the Shema. And when we say it in the morning, we need to stand up and say the Shema. Beit Hillel, their opinion is, no, it also says, Uvlechtecha v'derech, and when you're walking along the way. And what that means is that actually we can recite the Shema at the appropriate time in whatever posture we happen to be. We can say it when we're sitting, we can say it when we're lying down, we can say it when we're standing, we can say it when we're walking along our way. And note that in each case, right, each school has its textual justification for why the halacha is in accordance with their particular opinion, right? Beit Hillel have their textual justification. Beit Shammai have their textual justification. And note that in the case of Beit Hillel, right, they give their justification. It says, Uvlechtecha v'derech, when you're walking along the way. But then they have to turn around and explain, okay, if that's the case, then what do you do with the text, the other text that Beit Shammai is using, right? This is a key point when it comes to rabbinic interpretation of the Torah, which is when rabbis are engaging in debate around the Torah, right, about the proper Jewish practice, ideally, everything that they say is going to be justified with reference to some sort of interpretation of the Torah. They need to be able to point to a verse that gives an interpretive justification for what it is that they're arguing. But different schools of thought among the rabbis interpret those verses differently and utilize those verses in different ways. And so the differences between the two groups are often going to be revolve around this group is using this verse for this reason, and this other group is using the same verse for a different reason. And so they end up coming to different conclusions with regard to the halakha on a particular point. Any questions about that so far?
I don't have any questions, but I think I like it a little better.
Okay.
So there is no wrong or right answer. It's just a different way of interpretation.
Mhm.
Well, ultimately, right,
Yeah.
there has to be some sort of an answer in that it's impossible to follow the practice of both at the same time, right? Either you're going to be following one point practice or you're going to be following another practice. You can't follow both. And when it comes to Jewish practice in general, right, the general approach of rabbinic Jews has been to operate according to the principle that there is a halakha, right? There is an accepted mode of Jewish practice that is more or less normative for rabbinic Jews. That's obviously a little bit more complicated in the present day, where not all Jewish movements are equally focused on the idea of halakha as such, right? But certainly within the halakhic framework, there's going to be some sort of an answer in terms of how is it that we're actually practicing as a community. And so when you have differences of opinion, in this case, between two such great sages as Hillel and Shammai, or at least their students, then the question becomes what then happens, right? How do things fall out? So the really important point on that regard is this, and this is the key issue when it comes to Hillel and Shammai, is that by and large, the positions of Beit Hillel won out in the end. in later generations of rabbis, it was generally agreed that in most cases, the position of Beit Hillel is the halacha, and the position of Beit Shammai is not. There's one or two cases where either the Beit Shammai wins out, or there's a compromise position of some sort. But in the vast majority of cases, Beit Hillel win out. In a sort of mythological mode, it's told in one story that after 3.5 years of the two schools bickering back and forth and saying the halacha is according to us, the halacha is according to us, in the end, a bat kol, that's a Hebrew word which literally means an echo, or it means a heavenly voice. A voice out of heaven came out and it said, "These and those, both of the teachings, are the words of the living God, but the halacha is according to the position of Beit Hillel." In other words, both of these are valid positions, but the actual halacha, the practice, ought to go according to Beit Hillel. And the reasoning for this is interesting. The reason why Beit Hillel wins out, mostly, is because Beit Hillel are said to have been very kindly and modest in their attitude, especially in the sense that when they studied the Torah, they studied both their own positions and the positions of Beit Shammai. They studied both versions of halacha. And when they did so, they always mentioned the positions of Beit Shammai before their own. And because of that humility and that respect that they showed to their opponents, they merited to have their halakhic position win out in the end. At least that's the way that the tradition goes. I mean, there's other reasons too that might play a role there, right? In general, Beit Hillel's positions tend to be more liberal and more open, right? They leave more room for a variety of practice. They leave more options open for people. There's more freedom in the way that Beit Hillel interprets the Torah. Shammai's positions tend to be a lot more strict and restrictive. And so that may have played a role as well. But the reason given in the tradition is that Beit Hillel were modest and humble in their teaching style, and they would always teach the teachings of Beit Shammai before their own. And because they showed that respect for their opponents, their halacha ends up being the authoritative halacha that wins out in the end. Mickey.
So what was the fallout from this? I mean, we know that Hillel had 80 students or whatever. I don't know how many Shammai had. So what was the fallout? Did all of Shammai's students eventually go over to the Hillel side? Did it bring the community together, or did it further, did it kind of make the community split more?
Well, the important thing is that the community didn't split, right? Or at least the community of the Pharisees didn't, right? There were all sorts of divisions in Jewish society at that time. Remember that we're talking about the century leading up to the destruction of the Second Temple. This is a particularly fractious time in Jewish history, and there were many different parties that were very much at war with one another and would even do battle with one another in the streets. People died as a result of sectarian conflict between different groups of Jews. But in the end, part of what's being communicated with that story of the Bat Kol is that in the end, there's disagreement between the two schools, but that disagreement does not lead to a rupture between the different schools. They still understand themselves to be together as part of the same community, rather than splitting off into two different, warring factions that no longer see eye to eye at all. And part of the reason for that, I have to think, comes from that key point that when Hillel teach, they teach both teachings. Even if the halacha isn't according to Shammai, we still record the teachings of Beit Shammai, right? I showed you that passage from the Mishnah earlier, right? That's in the Mishnah, right? Which, as we said last week, is codified, comes to be written down 200 years after the destruction of the second, or nearly 200 years after the destruction of the second temple. Hillel and Beit Shammai are no more by that point. But nevertheless, we continue to teach the positions of Beit Shammai. And the reason for that is because it's the rabbinic culture, right, that was growing out of the Pharisaic movement at that time, found a way to enshrine difference of opinion, right, disagreement, as something that could be honored and respected, even when we nevertheless have to ultimately find a way to settle on this is the accepted practice for the community. We still find a way to honor the other side, to the other opinion.
Other people.
Yeah.
Just like you were saying, that there was a lot of sectarian violence, let's say, between the different Jewish groups at that time. It's important to, I think it's important to note that between the two schools, even though there was halakhic disagreement, there was peace, and they respected each other, and they intermarried. All right, you want to use that term. In other words, the men from Beit Hillel would marry women from Beit Shammai, and men from Beit Shammai would marry women from Beit Hillel. So there was a lot of unity, a lot of camaraderie, as well as disagreement between the two schools.
Exactly. And this is going to connect with another piece of text that I brought for you guys to look at tonight. This is another very important and famous passage. This is again from Mishnah Avot. Roz, would you mind unmuting yourself and reading this one? It's Mishnah Avot 5:17.
Oh, sure. Every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will in the end endure, but one that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure. Which is the controversy that is for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Hillel and Shammai. And which is the controversy that is not for the sake of heaven? Such was the controversy of Korach and all his congregation. Oh yeah, they rebelled. They wanted to be leaders, right? Yeah. Is that what they were referring to?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, I got
So
it.
that is really, what we're talking about there, right? The key piece of cultural inheritance that we still inherit from the two schools of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the most important piece of cultural heritage that we inherit from them is this concept of a disagreement that is for the sake of heaven, right? The idea that even after the battle has been fought and even after one side has won, nevertheless, we continue to remember and uphold with respect the position of the side that lost. And that idea, that cultural norm, is present throughout the rabbinic literature, which is going to come into exist in the generations after there's the destruction of the Second Temple, right? The entire structure of the Mishnah, the entire structure of the Gemara is founded on this principle, or at least incorporates this principle, that you always maintain all sides of the argument, because these and those are the words of the living God. That all of these arguments are ultimately worthwhile, even if when it comes to our practice, we have to ultimately end up settling on one particular approach, because that's just how it works.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I think, after reading a few things in the Talmud, I think they also had an eye that what might be correct in the generation writing down these arguments may not be correct in some future situation. And so they want to document it all so that if there's a point in time where there's what you're saying didn't work, that the alternative was there.
Absolutely, Sharon. And that's a point of view, a perspective that becomes extremely important for the modern phenomenon of the progressive branches of Judaism, particularly conservative Judaism, but also to an extent Reconstructionist Judaism as well, right? Where frequently the approach to Jewish practice that we find in these movements of progressive Judaism revolves around finding some other path, right? Some halakhic path that was not taken in the past, and saying, no, actually, we're going to take that path instead because there's a justification for it in the tradition. The neat thing about preserving all the different ways that we could have traveled means that sometimes when we need to find another path, we can go back and find that path, and it'll give us a way forward that maybe isn't offered by the halakha as it has come to be codified in later generations as it's come down.
In other words, it's using alternatives as if they come along.
Absolutely. Yeah. And finding those alternatives and thinking flexibly about this is the framework of the tradition as it's come down to us, and what can we make use of in the tradition, right? Is really central to what makes for a committed and engaged progressive Jew, right? Now, obviously, folks who belong to the Orthodox community might have a different approach to these issues, right? Because for them, precedent holds a much, much greater power of fixing things in one particular way, right? And they might not necessarily recognize the validity of going back and finding another path and going down that path instead. But certainly within progressive Judaism, this approach ends up being extremely important to the ways in which we find room for living our lives authentically as Jews committed to Torah and the values of Judaism, while at the same time acknowledging the importance of changing and adapting and growing the tradition from generation to generation in light of the needs of the generation, right? And also in light of addressing historical inequalities, right, that come to exist within the tradition itself. All right, we're coming close to the end of our time here. I want to just open it up. If anyone has any kind of lingering questions or any thoughts or comments that they'd like to share about some of the material we've been exploring today about Hillel and Shammai, I want to open it up for that.
I kind of had a thought about going back to the questions of the potential convert who's said, teach me the Torah on 1 foot. I'm kind of going with Shammai on this, because it's like the person saying, I dare you to teach me Torah. And I could very much understand Shammai realizing this and thinking, this person is not sincere. He really does not want to really learn, and shoos him away.
Yeah, I think also maybe it depends on the teacher as well, right? Sometimes it's not just about the students and the students' qualities. Sometimes it's about the teacher. It could be that Shammai understood about himself that there was no way that he had it in him to teach such a student with such an attitude toward the Torah. But Hillel maybe did have that skill, right? Did have that ability to reach someone who was in that place. And so sometimes maybe it's not even just about it's not just about the student's qualities. Sometimes it may be about being the right teacher. And some teachers are the right teacher for this student. And sometimes you realize that I am not the right teacher for this student. And being able to recognize that may in and of itself be a form of wisdom.
Okay. So with the differences between the two, there's the famous stories about Hillel, that's just before Shabbat, these guys come, they have a bet whether they can get him riled up and have him lose his cool. And so this one guy says, "Oh, I bet you I can make him lose his cool." And it's right before Shabbat, and Hillel's trying to get ready, and the guy goes and asks him, "Why do Babylonians have round heads?" And Hillel says, "Oh, that's a very good question." And he gives him an answer, and the guy goes away. 10 minutes later, comes back, and he's got another crazy question. And he says, "How come there are all people like you? You just made me lose 100 zoos because you didn't lose your cool."
Yeah.
But again, it just goes to the showing the patience that Hillel had in various situations.
Absolutely. The patience and the flexibility, right? That flexibility is a really key part of who Hillel is, I think, and another part of why he's such an important figure in the tradition. I'll actually leave you with this piece of information about Hillel, like speaking to this issue of flexibility that we've been talking about, which is that Hillel is the sage who's responsible for issuing the prosbul. This is an extremely important part of halakhic history. The prosbul, this is a legal decree that Hillel issued to prevent the cancellation of debts during the Shemitah year. Ordinarily, right, at least according to biblical law, the Shemitah year, every 7th year, all debts are canceled. And that's a mitzvah in the Torah, right? So you would think that would be about as fixed as it's possible to be. Hillel, however, took it upon himself to issue basically a blanket decree, more or less canceling that debt cancellation. He found a legal kind of workaround to make it work, right? But essentially, he's nullifying a decree from the Torah. The reasoning for this was that, as it happened, during the year leading up to the Shemitah year, people would refuse to lend money to the poor people because they knew their debt was going to get canceled. And so if poor people were not able to get the loans that they needed in order to live, and so the mitzvah of the Torah that was supposed to be helpful to people who were in need ended up being hurtful as a result. And recognizing this, Hillel issued the prosbul, this legal decree, which essentially nullified that cancellation of debts. And it's that kind of flexibility, the ability to recognize when a tradition isn't working, even if it was originally a very just and beautiful idea, right? And to find some way to change it in order to make things actually work for people as they're living their lives is a really key, I think, important quality that speaks to the importance of flexibility in our approaches to the Torah.
I had a thought I wanted to share that maybe an example of a modern day person emulating Hillel's ideals would be like a teacher that is able to bring a student that is really having difficulty learning and maybe even has like a learning difference to the Torah for their bar bat mitzvah. And I was just thinking of some friends of ours that have 2 autistic young boys, and that just a couple years ago they had their bar mitzvah together, and how really moving that was that they got to have one at their level, and they actually did a rocking job. It was fantastic, and it was just really, really awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks. I think we're going to need to cut it there. We've gone, I think, at this point a little bit over time. So thanks everybody for all your comments. I'm going to stop the recording now.